Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Stacy, and I'm a bookseller and the events coordinator at Belmont Books. Belmont Books, for those of you who are not familiar with us, is an independent and locally owned bookstore in Belmont, Massachusetts. Before we begin, I'd like to let you know that we have a number of virtual events coming up, including Sanjina Satyan discussing her new book, Gold Diggers, with Haya Bhuvaneshwar, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, on Thursday. You can register for these and our other events on our website, belmontbooks.com, which is also where you can purchase tonight's author books. If you have any questions for the authors, please type them into the Q&A section and we will get to as many questions as we can. We're very excited to welcome back Julie Carrick Dalton and Nancy Johnson, who have done events with us before, and to welcome Desmond Hall, who we're excited to meet. I will now turn the event over to our moderator, Leslie Teel, who will introduce the authors and get the event underway.
Okay, just making sure I'm not on mute. I'm always accidentally on mute, so. Hello, greetings everybody. Thank you for zooming in tonight for Craft on Draft. If you are unfamiliar with Craft on Draft, it is a reading series created and managed by the alumni of Grub Street's Novel Incubator program, and devoted to great fiction and the mechanics behind it. At each Craft on Draft, 3 authors read and discuss their work. And tonight I am super psyched to introduce these 3 wonderful writers. And if you haven't read their books yet, you really need to. They are on sale via Belmont Books, and the link should be in the chat, or if it isn't yet, it will be. Also, keep checking the chat for fun facts about each author that Novel Incubator alum Rob Wilstein will be posting throughout the event. We will be, I think everybody will be mute during the presentation, but there will be a Q&A afterwards, so please post your questions in the Q&A. There will also be a link in the chat with instructions for donating to the Novel Incubator Scholarship Fund. Tonight's event should run approximately 1 hour. And our topic is world building, turning setting into character. For some books, the setting is so pivotal, the story could not take place anywhere else. And tonight's guest authors have built such a strong sense of place in each of their novels that you feel like you're walking in it and feeling it as you read. And they will be discussing building those worlds that are just as vivid as the characters that live in them. So usually this event includes drinks, but since we're doing it virtually, I would like to know what each of tonight's authors are drinking and why. Nancy, I'll start with you. What is your beverage tonight?
It's good you started with me since I'm just drinking some water. You know, it's interesting. That's what Des and Julie are drinking. I'm the honorary teetotaler.
Hey, I hear you. I'm just drinking water tonight.
Some water, you know.
Okay.
Hopefully whenever I read, it'll be more exciting than what I'm drinking.
I'm sure. I'm sure. All right, Des, I bet you have something good.
Oh, I will, you know, later. But I've been taking my daughters are back to their sports, which means I'm back to being Uber dad. So I'm driving them everywhere early in the morning. So to keep myself alert, it's just good old coffee for now. But Cafe Bustelo, which is very nice.
Bustelo. Oh, yeah,
very nice. But
good.
Later on, might be something in the Scotch variety.
Yeah, I thought you might, but I thought you might wait.
Yeah.
All right. How about you, Julie? What have you got?
Well, I'm drinking out of my Grub Street glass, and it looks like a fun cocktail, but it's raspberry seltzer. It's just, I wasn't feeling it tonight, but I could lie and say this is a fruity tropical cocktail, but it's raspberry seltzer. It's that kind of night.
Right.
Well,
cheers, everybody.
Seltzer can be a very fun thing to drink. Very refreshing. All right. Well, with that, I guess we can get started with our guests, and I'm thrilled to introduce our first guest, Julie Carrick Dalton. Has many amazing skills, but one of them is creating visual timelines and beats for her stories. And it was the envy of our entire incubator class, and clearly it paid off. Julie's debut novel, Waiting for the Night Song, has been named one of the most anticipated 2021 book lists by CNN, Newsweek, USA Today, Parade, BuzzFeed, and others, and was an Amazon editor's pick for best books of the month in January. As a journalist, Julie has published more than 1,000 articles in publications, including the Boston Globe, Business Week, The Hollywood Reporter, and the Chicago Review of Books. A Tin House alum, a 2021 Breadloaf Environmental Writers Conference Fellow, and a graduate of Grub Street's Novel Incubator. Julie is a member of the Climate Fiction Writers League and is a frequent speaker and workshop leader on the topic of fiction in the age of climate crisis. She is also the mom of 4 kids and 2 dogs. Take it away, Julie.
Well, thank you, Leslie. I'm so excited to be here with my good friends, Des and Nancy, and with all the Incubees I see out in the chat. This is wonderful. And thank you to Belmont Books for hosting us. We couldn't have survived this pandemic as writers without the independent bookstore. So if you're going to buy books tonight, which I hope you do, buy them from Belmont Books. We're here to talk about setting, which is one of my favorite things to talk about. I'll tell you a little bit about my book for those of you who don't know, just a quick overview. So Waiting for the Night Song, it's my debut book, came out in January. It's a thriller, it's a suspense novel, but at its core, it's really a story about friendship, a fierce friendship between 2 women. It's about secrets and betrayal and redemption, and it's all set against the backdrop of a slowly changing climate in a small New England town. And the backdrop of this story is really important. It plays the setting of New Hampshire is very important in the story. It's a dual timeline narrative told from the perspective of my main character. Her name's Katie Kessler. And we hear from her as an 11-year-old and we hear from her as an adult. So the chapters go back and forth in time, and there's a mystery in the childhood timeline and a mystery in the adult, and they converge. So when we meet Katie as an adult, she is a forestry researcher. So we're going to get a lot of forest in the story, a lot of trees and nature imagery. And she's trying to prove that an invasive beetle is threatening the forest that she loves and that she works in and that she grew up in. In the childhood timeline, Katie and her best friend Daniela are playing in these woods and the lake, having this idyllic childhood until they witness a traumatic event. And they choose to cover up this crime they witnessed for reasons that make sense to an 11-year-old. But it ends up haunting them for the rest of their life. And so when we meet Katie as an adult, as a forestry researcher, she's facing a pivotal point in her career, but this childhood secret is going to come crashing back into her life. All of this is set in New Hampshire, which is a very special place to me. I own and operate a small farm in New Hampshire. So the setting and the backdrop of the story is what I was looking out the window at while I was writing this book. And it's a really special place to me. So a lot of people, when they talk about my book or review my book, they mention the forest and the trees and the mountain scenery. So I've talked about the trees a lot, but I want to talk tonight about the granite. It's in the granite state, and the granite mountains, the boulders, the rocks, the stones they walk on underpin this whole story. So I'm not going to talk about the trees tonight because I've talked about the trees a lot. So I'm going to read you a section from chapter 1. And what I want to maybe to listen to when I'm reading it is how Katie is going to get a piece of difficult information that's going to be presented to her. And she's going to be responding to it in terms of nature. She's going to be seeing things, tasting things, observing things, and doing things. And somehow all of this is going to be linked to the granite that she's sitting on. So this is Katie as an adult in chapter 1. Katie selected a potato-sized stone from the ledge and dusted it against her thigh. She pressed her tongue to the rock, leaving a wet oval to reveal its hidden mineral life. The dull grays and browns of New Hampshire granite burst into streaks of silver and layers of radiant amber at the touch of her saliva. A creamy, jagged vein glowed in the sunlight. The oval shrank as the wind sucked the light from the rock until it reverted back to its flat finish. The iridescence of veiled colors fizzed on her tongue. Her mouth watered. She tucked the stone in the bottom of her backpack, cradling it in the center of the tambourine she carried to scare off bears. It's just one stone, she told herself. When she built her own house someday, the rocks she'd collected would form the skirt around her hearth. Stolen pieces of every mountain she hiked, markers of time. The stack of stones, at least 30 by now, formed a cairn in her apartment. She often wondered if the dilapidated building could bear the weight or if one day it would all come crashing down. Her cell phone buzzed against the granite slab as a text came through. It's Daniela, they found him. The minerals on her tongue turned to acid. She read and reread the words until they became a jumble of illegible letters and the screen powered down. She hurled a rock off the ledge and held her breath as it struck the slope below, unleashing a torrent of cascading stone. This couldn't be happening. I'm home, I need you here, Daniela texted again. They're questioning my dad. Katie imagined the text in Daniela's childhood voice and didn't restrain the sob that burst out with decades of compressed guilt. More than 25 years had passed since she had spoken to Daniela Garcia. If she acknowledged Daniela, Katie would no longer be able to pretend that long ago summer had never happened. The fiction of Katie's childhood, rewritten and edited so she could sleep at night, would come undone. The single gunshot echoed in her mind. Or she could stay on her mountaintop, turn off her phone. She could hide for just a little longer, at least until the fires got too close. She put her head between her knees and stared down at the fissures in the slab. She scratched a rock on the surface of the ledge, leaving white letters next to her wood samples. Katie was here. It felt childish, but she traced the letters until they stood out in bold blocks. Katie was here. Horizontal lines in the granite recorded time, 100,000 years between lines of crystallized minerals. Climbing her mountains meant traveling through time, treading on scars of each millennia. Unknowable catastrophic events had bent the stone, folding time in on itself. Moments that were never meant to touch, fused together in geological history. So I'm going to pause there. And this is Katie in her element, in her world, her work world as a forestry researcher, but it's also who Katie is. She very much feels that she is a product of the land she grew out of. And it's not just, I think for Katie, the scenery around her and the land is not a stage. She's not acting on a stage in front of this landscape. She is part of it. And I feel like the landscape and the setting move through Katie as much as she moves through the landscape. And she feels very connected to this place. She feels protective of it, but she also feels like she is part of it intrinsically, like on a molecular level. So I'm going to read you one more paragraph, which is from an earlier a chapter. It's still very early in the book, so this isn't giving you away any big spoilers, but this paragraph is after she goes home. She's gotten this text from Daniela, this disturbing piece of information that's come to light. So she goes back to her childhood cottage in the woods where she and Daniela used to play. And she gets up early in the morning before any of the boaters are out, and she goes skinny dipping to clear her mind. So then I'm going to read one last paragraph here. Free and aimless, she drifted. She sank until the chill enveloped the crown of her head. Lake water lived inside her. She had swallowed and inhaled it in gulps and gasps. Flecks of eroded granite boulders and millennia-old secrets had settled in her cells. She had always been made of these mountains, this lake, this forest. And she had reciprocated with sacrifices of her own blood, tears, sweat, and urine, which circulated among the fish, feeding the lilies and the roots of the blueberry bushes. But could the forest absorb a gun? Her younger self would have imagined the roots and tendrils pulling the ugly memories deep below the surface. She longed to believe in the magic of the forest again, instead of the indisputable reality that only a person could have removed the gun. So in this scene, Katie is literally re-immersing herself in her childhood home. And this feeling of the particles that are eroded from these granite mountains that made their way down the streams and into this lake that are suspended in the water that she's ingesting, that is settled into her body. She is a part of this lake. And she has contributed her own blood, sweat, tears, and urine to feed the lake. And she is, I like to think of it that the setting is passing through Katie. in as much as Katie herself is passing through the setting. And I don't think that she could exist as a character without this setting. You know, we talked about what makes this setting unique to this story. I don't think my story could exist in another setting. These particles, this granite and this lake and these mountains are so much a part of who Katie is, and telling the story. And it's also part of who I am in a lot of ways. As I was writing this book, I was building my own farm. Literally, physically, I was out in the dirt digging, and I had particles of those granite boulders in the dirt under my fingernails. And I would get dirty and sweaty, and I would go jump in that lake and wash it all off. And then I'd come inside and I would write. And that's where this book came from. So I kind of like to think that maybe it was moving through me too, like it's moving through Katie. So when I see this landscape, I don't see as Katie plunked down in the landscape. I see her as like a living part of a living landscape. That for me is, you know, it was a joy to write because it's a place that's really dear to my heart. So I'm going to pause there and pass it on to our next author. And I love both of these other books and these authors, and I can't wait to hear about the setting and their stories. So thank you.
Yay. Oh, Leslie, I think you're on mute.
I know, I always do that, sorry. But I'm just so psyched to introduce our next guest, another fellow graduate of Novel Incubator Season 6. With his filmmaker background, Des was amazing at helping us all visualize our scenes like a screenwriter would. And reading his book is like watching a movie and being on the edge of your seat the whole time. Desmond Hall is a Jamaican-born author whose debut YA novel, Your Corner Dark, was inspired by the murder of his uncle in Jamaica. Your Corner Dark is a searing and gritty book that looks at the harsh realities of gang life in Jamaica and how far a teen is willing to go for family. The book confronts police brutality, colorism, gang culture, and political deception. Hall has written and directed A Day in Black and White, an HBO feature movie that was nominated for the Gordon Parks Award. He's also written and directed a full-length stage play, Stockholm, Brooklyn, that won the Audience Award at the Downtown Theater Festival at the Cherry Lane Theater. As a former advertising creative director, Hall has written 2 Super Bowl commercials, wow, and won multiple awards while running the creative side of Spike Lee's advertising agency. Phew, go Daz.
Well, hello, everybody. I want to, thank Leslie, Belmont Books, the people behind the scenes at Craft and Draft, Rob Wilstein, Bonnie Walsh, Julia Rold, and Carol Gray. I think I didn't miss anyone. But and then of course, given that we are, Julie and I are graduates of Novel Incubator, big shout out to our professor, Michelle Hoover. Love you, Michelle. So yeah, everybody, thanks for that, introduction. Your Corner Dark in Jamaica is a phrase that means, being stuck between a rock and a hard place. So if you were like a Celtics fan, you'd say, man, the Celtics lost again and Jaylen Brown's hurt, the corner dark, and so the story is, about this high school kid, Frankie Greed. He gets an all expenses paid scholarship, a golden ticket to leave Jamaica to go study engineering in the States. This is a huge thing because jobs for young people in Jamaica are really hard to get. And unfortunately for Frankie, a tragedy happens. I won't give the spoiler away. And he has to turn away possibly from his scholarship. And he has to then struggle with the help of his girlfriend, Leah. And they have struggled together to try to make a new life and to try to forge their way forward. So the story is a lot about choices, which I think is really important for teens, because if you remember back to, your teenage days, I know in mine, every time I made a bad choice, I thought it was the end of the world. And, Frankie makes a really tough choice. It's one of those devil's deals where there's no good choice to make. So you'd say to Frankie, boy, you're kind of dark, So in the story, Jamaica is a character. You know, this is not the Jamaica inside the resort walls, it's outside the resort walls, where, you know, crime, you know, has boomed, unfortunately. When I was a kid, my parents slept with, you know, we went to sleep with the doors open and the windows open to catch the night air. Now you go all over Jamaica and every, you know, door and window is barred, and, you know, crime has just gone through the roof. And a lot of that has to do with the two-party system, the JLP and the PNP, the equivalent of the Democrats and Republicans in Jamaica, because they started the gangs in order to control the votes, and they've now gone out of control. So this story, you know, speaks to a lot of that history as well. So with that said, I'm going to read 3 segments, and I'm going to share with you 3 different approaches that I use to work on the world building for Your Corner Dark. The first one is, I guess I'd call it classic, you know, describing the scenery, the objects, and the music. You know, can't think of Jamaica without thinking of the music. The second technique is one that I borrowed from the film world, where I created an image system. A lot of filmmakers create image systems to, you know, bring something out of the environment into the sort of fore and really use it to hammer home the theme of the book. It works on a conscious and subconscious level. And then lastly, I'm going to share something I learned from my amazing editor, Caitlin DeLuey, which is the difference between authorial writing and speaking from the narrator's voice, which is really important for young adult literature. So without further ado, here we go. Frankie put down his empty water bucket on the side of a steep mountainside road that was just wide enough for a sedan and 2 well-fed goats. The sun had just started to warm, too early for the post office to be open. Still, Frankie gazed at the ramshackle building. His scholarship letter could be inside. It was nearly all he thought about these days. If it came, if it brought good news, he soon would be headed off to study in America. Jamaica was so bankrupt it could hardly afford hope. But hope was Frankie's light, and he shined it often. In the distance lay miles of lush green forest and fields, and beyond that, the capital city of Kingston. A handful of 20-story structures sat in the center of the skyline. So you notice there, you know, the juxtaposition with the ramshackle post office, where he lives in the mountains, and in the distance, you know, the city with the skyline. You guys sort of showing the juxtaposition where he comes from and what the town is. And then you think about what America could be for this kid. You know, it's like a dream come true. So the Olympic Stadium, where he'd once seen the Jamaican sprinters practice relays, stood the University of West Indies campus. Frankie knew he could get into their engineering program, but all a Jamaican diploma guaranteed was debt. Jobs for young people were just too hard to find. Gnats circled. Frankie stuck a forefinger in the corner of his eye and removed the dead one. He studied it. His own career might be as short-lived, even if he got a chance to study at University of Arizona. A classmate's older brother had recently come back from America. He hadn't been able to secure work, even though he had a master's degree in engineering. No way was Frankie going to let that happen. He flicked that gnat away. So, you know, again, using the creatures from the background in the setting to sort of highlight, you know, Frankie's attitude. The gnat went in his eye, but he flicks it away as, you know, he, the narrator, speaks about not giving up and persevering. Then the rev of an engine broke the early morning quiet. A black Toyota barreled down the mountainside towards him. A thumping bass and pulsating rhythm rippled through the hot, humid air. Sizzler's raspy voice and reggae lyrics flowed from the car stereo. His Uncle Joe's long, sinewy arm emerged from the window. So I mentioned the music here. Sizzler is a Rastafarian Jamaican singer who sings conscious lyrics. That means, you know, singing about love, caring, unity, etc. Versus the dance hall lyrics, and this will be made clear later, where dance hall, it speaks to a lot of misogyny, a lot of violence, gunplay, and over sexualization, actually. And, it sort of shows that Joe is striving towards this, this ideal that Sizzler's music, which always plays every time Joe appears in a scene or in a chapter. And it really speaks to who he is or who he wants to be. Whether he gets there or not is sort of up in the air. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to move forward to the example that I mentioned with the image system. So to quickly explain an image system again, filmmakers sit down, the director sits down with the cinematographer, the set designer, and they figure out images that would naturally occur in the environment, but they highlight them. And one of the greatest examples of this is the great movie Casablanca. So, the people are stuck in Casablanca, right? The Nazis have occupied the area in the 1940s. And what the director and cinematographer did was they created a searchlight in the town. And in all the external scenes, the searchlight's going around, always looking for people. It's not mentioned, but it's there very clear in the background, showing the prison. Another thing the cinematographer did was use lighting to create bars. It's in the background a lot, like up in the background in front of people's faces, etc., to show and try to highlight a prison. And also there's always an image, between characters that appears, again, showing separation and entrapment. So what I've done in Your Corner Dark is I chose water. Frankie has to go to the standpipe to get water because a lot of Jamaican households don't have running water. And in fact, sanitation conditions are even worse. So water is a precious thing. And Frankie plays this game where he carries a bucket of water back home every morning for his daily chore. And water's precious, and he tries to not spill any. But in the scenario, Frankie spills some water in order to break up a fight. And as he breaks up this fight, then his father yells at him. His father's very traditional, very old school. And he, confronts Frankie in a very aggressive way because he was fighting, even though it was to save his best friend from a bully. And at that point, Frankie, being a frustrated teenager, sort of spills the water and throws it away. He's not the perfect hero, right? But he's a teenager that feels the frustration. So in a way, the arc of the scene is he goes to fetch a pail of water with hope. And as he goes along, he puts that water down in order to help his friend. But then his family troubles intervene and he throws the water away, even though he knows he has to go and get another bucket. And this water scenario or image system replays several times through the book. So lastly, I'm just going to read the last one brief passage. And here, this example is from my editor, Caitlin DeLuey, where she taught me a lot about, authorial writing versus writing from the narrator's point of view, which is appropriate for young adult literature. So in authorial writing, the author can, paint the picture. But in young adult, it needs to come from from the main character's voice. And it has to, relate to that character. And you'll see here how Frankie uses his own imagery. He describes it from his point of view, and it really speaks to his hopes and goals. So here goes. Just past a row of flowering breadfruit trees, Frankie looked out over the gully at the explosion of green, coffee plantations that had been there for decades. The blue mountains wore mist like fine jewelry. This could be a scenic overlook, he thought. Much construction wouldn't be needed. A small loader tractor and a few volunteers could do the trick. And several times throughout the book, Frankie looks, he's in a hospital and he's waiting to check out a patient, and he comments, for us through his voice, not through the author's voice, but his voice, where he thinks about the construction of the hospital. and he thinks about the construction of other places. You know, the kid wants to be an engineer. And if we, you know, think back again, you can almost always tell what somebody was studying, you know, each semester, because that's what the kids would be talking about, right? If you're studying statistics, someone would have some statistics metaphor to talk about the reason why they're going to school or playing on the team. So those are, you know, the three things I wanted to share: the classic technique, the image system, and authorial writing versus writing from the main character's point of view. Thanks. And I guess it's time to turn it over back to Leslie.
Thank you so much. Beautiful examples. Okay, let me. So I was not lucky enough to be in a workshop with tonight's third guest, but many of us consider her an honorary incubee. And I'm thinking she's maybe the 11th season sixer. Yeah. I mean, you know, besides Michelle, of course. So Nancy Johnson, as a native of Chicago's South Side, Nancy writes at the intersection of race and class. She worked for more than a decade as an Emmy-nominated, award-winning television journalist at CBS and ABC affiliates and markets nationwide. Her amazing debut novel, The Kindest Lie, has been reviewed by the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times, and was featured on Entertainment Weekly's Must list. It's been named one of the most anticipated books of 2021 by Newsweek, O, the Oprah magazine, Shondaland, NBC News, Marie Claire, Elle, the Chicago Tribune, the New York Post, Good Housekeeping, Parade, Refinery 29, and more. Booksellers nationwide selected her novel as an indie next pick, and librarians chose it for library reads. A graduate of Northwestern University and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, Nancy lives in downtown Chicago and manages brand communications for a large healthcare nonprofit. The Kindest Lie is her first novel. Take it away, Nancy.
Thank you so much. I wish I hadn't had you read that whole bio. Now I feel pressure. Anyway, I just want to say thank you so much to you, Leslie. Thank you to Belmont Books for being so supportive of me many times now with my debut novel, The Kindest Lie. And also just want to thank Grub Street as well. You guys have been so good to me, Julie and Des, and so many of you, Milo, all of you guys just being so welcoming to me. I really appreciate it. It feels like a second home for me. So anyway, again, the book is The Kindest Lie. It is a story of race, class, and family at the dawn of the Obama era. It's a story about a woman named Ruth Tuttle, who's a very successful Ivy League educated Black engineer in Chicago. She's on the come up. She's got a great job, great husband, but she's been harboring a big secret. And the secret is that she had a baby when she was just 17 years old. And she left that child behind in the dying Indiana factory town where she grew up. And so she decides she needs to go back to her hometown to find her son. And when she gets there, that's when she meets and forms this unlikely friendship with a poor young white boy who's nicknamed Midnight. And the two of them are on this collision course of race and class, and their lives are just changed forever. So I'm just going to read two sections for you. The first one is from the first chapter of the book. And the first chapter is the election night scene. And so Ruth and her husband Xavier are at their home and they're hosting an election night watch party with their friends. And so I'm reading for the sake of time, just starting in the middle of that scene. Xavier whooped and gave her a ball drop New Year's Eve style kiss. The townhouse vibrated with their jubilation. Guests lifted their glasses and their voices in a toast to their own manifest destiny. And out of the corner of her eye, she saw Harvey, who was usually the loudest in any room, rocking quietly in a chair with his folded hands pressed against his lips. Then they rolled up the living room rug to do stepper sets and slides, with Xavier breakdancing like he was 13 instead of 32. Somehow she needed to store every part of this moment burned it into her being so it would still be real when she lived it again as memory. She wanted to scoop up the feeling, bottle it, and tighten the cap so none could seep out ever. But at the same time, her instincts told her to share it. So she opened the windows to give the neighborhood a contact high. Keeping it old school, the Gap Band's Outstanding blasted from the speakers, and they took turns strutting down the Soul Train line. Xavier's breath warmed Ruth's neck, and from behind, he wrapped his arms around her waist, and they rocked gently to the beat. With his wife at home, Harvey managed to slide into a dance sandwich between Penelope and Tess, who always humored the old man. Their feet felt light, and their chests too, the weight of wait your turn, not so fast, and never having lifted, at least for one night. Ruth and Xavier ate and danced until the sun poked through the blinds, bathing their townhouse in a groggy afterglow, spotlighting barbecue-stained plates and her high-heel shoes slung in a corner of the room. In the early hours of the morning, Ruth lay on the love seat, the high still buzzing in her head, Xavier's face inches from hers. She stared at his profile and ran her forefinger down his long nose to his lips, past his chin to his pronounced Adam's apple. His skin tone reminded her of the rich Mississippi soil where Mama was born, with flecks of red and yellow just under the surface. He was prone to faking sleep, and it wasn't until she blew a noisemaker gently in his ear that his lips moved. You think our kid could be president someday? His voice had turned rusty from all the celebrating. This was the first time Xavier had spoken of anything as tangible as an occupation for their not yet born imaginary child. In the morning sun, the thought of babies unmoored her. Aren't you getting ahead of yourself, she said. I don't know, maybe you're right. We have plenty of time to map out that kid's future. He lifted one eyebrow. What I do know, though, is now that we got a Black president, I'm taking chitlins to the office today. And after a few seconds of silence, he laughed, and she did too, their heads falling back like dominoes from the force of it. Maybe she laughed a bit too hard in relief that he was no longer talking about children. She poked at his side. You are ridiculous. You better leave your chitterlings at home, she said, emphasizing each syllable for effect, at least until the man takes the oath of office. Don't mess around and get your black butt fired now. They stayed like that for hours, giggling softly and smiling at everything and nothing, wrapped in each other's arms, hung over with hope. And so that's the end of the first chapter. And so I think just in creating that setting, everything had a purpose. I tried to be intentional about that opening chapter, that Obama election night party. And so you've got, you see a lot about class here. These are, for the most part, bougie Black people, and they're doing these stepper sets and these slides. And so like stepper sets are very much a Chicago thing. So there's culture that I'm revealing in the setting. There's the dancing. There's the Soul Train line, which is about culture, Black culture. There's the barbecue stained plates, the music, the laughter, the opening the window to give the contact high to the neighborhood. All of that speaks to the hope and the joy that these people are feeling about having a Black man enter the White House. It's something they never imagined. And then you have Harvey. So you've got him dancing with the two women, but also earlier in that scene, you see him sitting there with his hands pressed against his lips, and there he's just rocking quietly. He's a man who usually is loud and talking, but he's rocking quietly in that chair. And you can picture him there. And that's a detail of the setting that tells you there's a lot of history in that moment. And that for him, this is not just any other election night, but it means more than that. And that detail of him sitting there is about the history of that moment. It's about everything that has been endured and sacrificed to get them all there to that particular moment in time and in history. And also the language that you see, the way the dialogue at the end of it. I think language is also a part of setting. You hear how Ruth and Xavier are talking to each other. That's part of the setting. It's building up what I'm doing with code switching. We have a scene later in the book where you see Ruth at work and where she's struggling a little more. She's in an all-white environment that she's used to, but there's a certain way she has to comport herself and she's still not getting ahead. But here, she can be herself. They can speak in their own vernacular. They can speak the way they want as Black people, as husband and wife. And so there's also a piece there that I think is very important with language. in terms of revealing something about the setting and who the people are. And again, hope, that's a big theme in the book. So you see in that setting, everything is about celebration and hope. And then later in the book, you see what happens when there's a dearth of hope, when they lose hope. And so this next portion of a scene I'm going to read to you is where Ruth goes home. I told you that she's going to go back to her hometown to search for her son. She hasn't been there in a long time. She stayed away for many years. And so this is when she gets there to her grandmother's house. She was raised by her grandmother, Mama. Standing on this side of her childhood house, Ruth remembered leaving in her old Pinto at 17 with no baby, yet still heavy with her burden. When she had come home on college break during the winter holidays, she had tried not to look at anything too long, moving in and out quickly enough to avoid any fresh stabs of guilt. One thing she did recall from that trip home was the house, its yellow paint faded and peeling in places. Ganton, that's the hometown, Ganton had been cut off at the knees, folding in on itself, knocked down too many times to stand up straight again. A broken beer bottle and an empty Cheetos bag poked out of the snow next to one driveway on the corner. Mama told her that house had become a Section 8 rental property with a revolving door of tenants who had no ties to the community or investment in its upkeep. But the neighborhood held good memories too. Ruth and Eli used to own these streets. 6 years older than she, her brother did everything first. Ride a bike, go to school, lose teeth, and grow new ones. But long past the point of it being cool, Eli still hung out with his kid sister. They drew blue and yellow chalk lines on this asphalt for hopscotch games and skipped down the street to chase the chimes of the ice cream truck. Back then, Ruth didn't understand what it meant to be poor. Every house, for as far as she could see, stood tall and proud, one no better or worse than the one beside it. What if Xavier had come with her on this visit? She pictured him at home in their living room with his feet propped up on the ottoman watching football. Had she let her fears irreparably damage her marriage? It had been 4 years since Ruth had been home. She only returned then with Xavier to be married at their home church by Pastor Bumpus, the preacher who had baptized her. A few hours in Ganton, just long enough for the ceremony, and that was it. She hustled Xavier out of town as soon as they said their I do's. It didn't matter that he wanted to see the house she'd grown up in. That house seemed so meager, and crazy as it sounded, she feared its walls might tell her story, revealing that she'd been a pregnant teenager. Now the house was bathed in a warm, earthy brown. Ruth and Xavier had spent months poring over color wheels for their own home renovation, and if she had to guess, this paint color had to be some variation of Moroccan spice. There was no Christmas wreath on the door, but that wasn't surprising since Mama thought the holidays were too commercial anyway, only about the almighty dollar instead of the almighty himself. Icicles hung suspended from the aluminum siding, one of them crackling before falling silently in the snow. After Ruth rang the bell twice, the front door grunted and then cracked open, only as far as the short chain would allow. She remembered that space between the screen door and the main one, where flies went to die during the summer. A face peered through the small opening before the door shut. As Ruth held the screen door open, the chain jangled, and then the door opened fully, and Mama stood there with her eyes wide as a baby deer's. And so from there, you see the reunion with her grandmother, with Mama. And so this scene with the setting, it's really about a return home, what it means to return home after having been gone a long time, and what that feeling evokes. I remember the author Ann Hood talking once about telling a story and the setting of standing on the other side of a door that you haven't been on the other side of in a long time. And I was thinking a lot about that. You know, what does it mean to be looking at your childhood home, the place where you grew up, but to stand on the other side of it when you haven't been back? And there's so many memories there. And so that's what you see there. You know, Ruth is seeing her old house, that setting through the lens of her upscale life now in Chicago. So you get that sense. She notices the disrepair, the things that are broken, the physical things that are broken, but there are also the relationships that are broken. And I think there's some symbolism in that disrepair, in that neighborhood. That's also about the disrepair in her family and in her community. Class differences play a big role in the book. And in the setting, you could visualize Ruth as a woman with a foot in two different worlds. She's got her bougie, fancy life in Chicago. She's got home, which is still a big part of where she's from. And so it's about viewing things through the lens of memory. You know, you have the part in there about she and her brother, Eli, playing hopscotch and chasing the ice cream truck and the chimes that they hear from the truck. And then you're going to meet her brother soon in the next scene, and you're going to see their relationship that is now dissolved. And a relationship that has a lot of problems. It hasn't dissolved, I shouldn't say that, but it's strained. Now there's some rivalry there, but you're also going to learn about how he's been a protector for her in many ways that she didn't realize. And yet right here in the way she looks at her house, the memories come flooding back of the relationship, and that grounds her. And then, as I said in here in the scene, the setting is also about a house that holds her secrets. Will this house and the walls of this house keep those secrets? And that's a question for the book that you learn through the setting. So thank you so much.
Wow, okay, thank you so much. Lovely readings from everybody, for wonderful books with great settings. Thank you all so much. We do have some questions in the Q&A that I will ask. Let's see. I got 3, so I'll direct them to individuals, and then you know, if other people want to chime in and answer the question as well, just so there's not confusion about who's supposed to answer. So I'll start with you, Nancy, since you just read. How do you go about writing and selecting the details of setting you need in a particular scene? Do you rely more on memory or reality to bring in the details of the place that you've experienced, or is it more about imagination and inventing what a particular character needs?
Yeah.
Or a combination? Yeah.
Sure. I think it's a combination of the two. You know, Ganton, Indiana is the setting, you know, for most of the book. And a lot of people have asked me about that town. I've had interviewers say, I Googled that town over and over and I couldn't find it. That's because it doesn't exist, you know, except in my imagination. So part of that was creating the world, but also was based upon things. It was memory. It was things that I remembered from other places I've been, towns I've been in. You know, this is a town in the industrial Midwest that is a victim of what's happening with the Great Recession in 2008. The auto plant has just closed. And so it's a combination of a lot of places. It's Kenosha, Wisconsin. I was a reporter there. My very first job, I think it was the Chrysler plant, had closed by the time I moved there. And so I understood what it was like to move into a town where the industry that was the beating heart of that town was no longer there. And so I created that. I have family in Gary, Indiana. I used that, you know, thinking about that. Gary is predominantly Black. This town is very racially mixed. But again, you've got a town where the steel mills left. And then there's also Anderson, Indiana, where I have an aunt and uncle. And there was the Delco Remy General Motors plant that was in that town, and it left. And so I know what it's like for that town to have what they've experienced. And so in that sense, I think that it was really about a collection of memories of my own and putting that together and creating a town based upon all these inputs of what I had experienced. And I've had so many people tell me that the town of Ganton feels like a character, because it really is. And in the way it moves and the way it symbolizes everything that's been lost and the economic strain, which seems to exacerbate the racial tensions. And so there's so much that I'm doing with that setting and with that town to tell you a story about race and class in America.
Cool. Julie or Des, anybody want to chime in on those?
I'll take a stab at that. So in my book, the details, a lot of them are very real. They are based on phenomena I observed on my own farm in New Hampshire, but a lot of it was imagination, that I would imagine the what if. If I would see the temperature where my growing region in New Hampshire, the temperature has gone up, which would inspired the climate themes in my book. So I would see certain invasive species moving in. We have a lot of invasive plants in the lake. And it made me want to know more about what other ones. So I don't have particular knowledge of some of the, or I didn't before, of some of the invasive species and endangered species in my book, but they were inspired by real species. So I did the research, and they're all real. It's all based on real science, but so a lot of it was inspired by a real moment, a real event, a real creature or a plant. But it took some work to fill it out. So there was a combination of a lot of, science and real tangible things, but the emotional impact was all real. Like even if I changed the insect I was talking about, the emotional feeling I have about my land and about the forest that I manage a forest that's about 92 acres, and I care about it. So the emotion my characters have towards the land and their connection to it is a real memory, even though some of the details and how we get to that memory in the story are not my own personal experience.
Thank you. We can move on to another question, just to make sure we have plenty of time. We're getting a few. So Des, I will go to you and ask, do you plan your settings ahead of time, like the characters, or do the settings end up writing themselves as you draft?
Yeah. So I always start out plotting, as you know, Julie knows, and people in class, I voraciously plot. And by creating, as I mentioned, the image system, I think I research a lot from the environments that I know. So I think about the areas in Jamaica that I'm familiar with, and then I would sort of mine different images out of those environments to sort of highlight the character and to raise the stakes. Another thing that's really important for me is research, and because I don't know all the areas, and like Nancy mentioned with Ganton, the area of Troy in Jamaica doesn't exist, and that was really important for me because as you mentioned in the setup, I have some family that made, some choices I wouldn't have made. I'll put it that way. And I've gotten into, incidences that I can't really, sort of zero in on because, Jamaica is a small country. And if you illustrate a place, people kind of know who you're talking about and what's going on. So I sort of created a fictitious place by using research. And unfortunately, I get a lot of research done. And that might sound weird, but what I mean is I read the Jamaican papers every day, and I even go on the CIA's website for their warnings with the Caribbean basin. And I mine a lot of that material. And, this is an interesting story. One of them I saw a shooting in a mall that was near where I, grew up when I was in Jamaica. And so I reached out to my cousin and said, well, them shoot up in the Westgate. And she tells me that my aunt was there during the shootout, just innocently having her, teeth worked on. And, again, it's a small country. But again, by doing a lot of research, imagination, and mining things from memory, I sort of cull them all together to, create a setting and to build the environment.
Right, cool, thank you. How about you, Nancy?
Yeah, I was going to just jump in and say that I don't plan setting ahead of time. I think what's most important is for me is starting with the story and the characters. And then that's what drives the setting. For me at least, I don't want to start with setting or world building because then I'm not thinking about character. And I think you've got to be thinking about character and I think the setting and the world building is there to drive the story arc, drive the character arc. And I really don't, I want my setting to be a bit unobtrusive in a way. I mean, it's there and it's important, but I don't want anyone to be focused on, oh, wow, look at that setting. You know, I want you to be thinking about the story and the characters first, and then the setting, like I said, is there to amplify what's happening with story and character.
Cool. Julie, I'll ask you the same question. I think it's a really interesting question, and your answers are all interesting.
Yeah, so with my book, the setting is very connected to the character, but I wasn't really thinking about it that way. I think my character is so naturally connected to the setting that the story just came out that way. That was present from the beginning, from the early drafts of the book, and just the way she processes her emotions are via nature, the way she thinks about things and the way she sees things. So I didn't plan it that way, but I think a lot of it is because I see things that way. So a lot of what you're getting from Katie's perspective is a lot of my perspective and the way I see things. So I didn't set out to intentionally build this story on the granite. It just emerged because that's where I was, and that's how I experienced the world. So it wasn't planned, but I think it's for me, the setting is very much tied to my characters.
Cool. So I mean, I think we're okay to have another question. And this is an interesting question. Like, Nancy, I know you were talking about symbolism, and so for any of you, I mean, we can start with Nancy. The symbolism and the meaning of the settings that you're talking about. Were all these intentional and thought out as you were writing or before you were writing, or were they just sort of, did you observe them afterward? Like were they kind of subconscious and then you saw, oh, hey, that's symbolism.
It's both. It's both. Yeah. I mean, I definitely thought about the theme of hope in creating that first scene, that Obama election night scene. I was definitely intentional about building the sense of hope. But then the juxtaposition with Ganton, some of that came later in terms of thinking about what that means and what that represents, and really thinking about Ganton as a character. That came later. And sometimes sometimes it's after your book comes out, at least for me, and you're in an interview and somebody mentions, oh, I love the symbolism of this and of that. And you're like, oh, I never really thought about it that way. So there have been situations where it's come to me later and I realized that certain things were being planted, but I didn't know it was happening subconsciously. And I hadn't really thought of that beforehand. So yeah, it definitely works both ways, some planned and some subconscious.
Yeah. How about you, Des?
Yeah, I plan a lot, and it's always for me about creating stakes, even through setting, because I think it's like really important, especially for the story I want to tell, to put the characters in, progressively difficult situations to reveal their true character, because we all know talk is cheap, right? Characters, like, real people, will say anything, but, their actions speak to really who they are. And so when I go ahead and I try to, combine the two, I do a lot of plotting to create the setting and, merge with it the stakes and the character and all of that. And then sometimes stuff occurs to me, like Nancy's saying, as, you're writing and you're like, oh yeah, that's great, you can use it. And then a lot of times after discovering it, you have to go back into the story if you really like the thing you've discovered that you've written subconsciously, and change the things before to make that new discovery work. So yeah.
Yeah. Definitely. I think we can all relate to that in many ways. How about you, Julie?
Yeah, I definitely find things when I go back in my work. There are things I absolutely intentionally put in the setting, but I have this theory that we lay subconscious Easter eggs in our book for ourselves to find on our revisions. And sometimes, when I go through my own writing, I find that I only mentioned one book on the shelf, like why that book? Is there something about that book that needed to be there that I can, open up? Or, why was she wearing that pair of boots? Or why did I pick that tree in the background? Was there something about that? And I find that I'm not consciously doing it, but I love that I think you need to trust yourself that you laid some good Easter eggs in there, and to go find them, because your subconscious is drafting along with you, and it's just leaving them there so you can move forward. But then when you go back, I think that these subconscious instincts give you opportunities to expand the setting a lot. And I found that, in fact, and like Des said, and I have had readers point out things that they loved that I did this thing in the book. It was so symbolic and so meaningful for them, and I had no idea what they were talking about. And then when I went back and I looked, I was like, oh, that was really great of me. I had no idea. It wasn't intentional, but I think that your subconscious guides you in ways that so maybe to trust yourself a little bit when you're doing that.
Cool. I think we all love when that happens, when we've accidentally written something. So I think we can squeeze one more in. And Julie, I'll go ahead and start with you. What's the one thing you think writers should most consider when they're thinking about and writing their settings?
Well, I think it should be something you're comfortable writing about. And I can give you a really quick example. I'm working on a second book right now, and I love nature. I love writing nature. I love having my characters touching it, seeing it, smelling it. And I put a character in the city, and it was not working. And my editor pointed this out to me, and she's like, you need to get her back near the dirt. You don't write well in a city because that's not your natural state. And I moved my character out of the city in this new book, and the book is going so much better. So I think you need to understand what your comfort level as a writer, and also to understand what your character's connection to that setting is. And it doesn't have to be just nature as a setting. It could be a room or an atmosphere or a feeling, but why it matters in the story, why it matters, why it's helping your story, that it's not just decorative, I would say.
Oh, yeah. How about you, Jazz?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Julie. So I'll use the example in the first draft of the second book. It was interesting. I moved it out of the capital city of Kingston to the second, quote unquote, second city of Montego Bay. And I think it's not easily, or it wasn't right away or readily, important that I do that, but it was an instinct. And then as I kept working on it, it became, clear, and it might be obvious, but it wasn't obvious while I was in the process. And it was that Kingston it's another crime story. So Kingston has a stratified criminal community. The inroads are very difficult to make, and you have to have a pretty, should I say, interesting business model to break into it. And Montego Bay, for a long time had never had a lot of criminality, but has had it a lot in the last several years. In fact, the government has called several state of emergencies where they've sent the soldiers to the Montego Bay area to seek out, criminals. And that became important because with the state of emergency going on, it was a town in transition. And that, served the story a lot better. So I think, in choosing the place, like Julie said, it has to be a place that serves your story. It really pushes it forward in its own way. It creates its own narrative drive in addition to the one you create.
Yeah. Nancy.
Yeah, I agree with Julie and Des on that point. I think my piece of advice would be that you don't have to, that the reader doesn't have to have the whole world, but just the important details of the world that you're building in the setting. I'm also working on a second book, and it's historical fiction, and so it's dual timeline, and part of it is 1960 Nashville during the time of the sit-ins of the civil rights movement. And I wasn't alive at that time. I wasn't there. And so I'm doing a lot of research, a lot of reading and interviewing people who were there at that time. And sometimes I can tell with this book, because it is historical, I'm getting bogged down in some of the details and trying to write it. But I have to keep reminding myself that, like I said, you don't the reader is not going to have to know everything, but maybe it's important for me to know everything to tell the story, but I don't need to put everything of that world and that setting on the page, but just the relevant details that are going to help us understand the character who's moving in that world, help us understand the time period of what it meant to be, an upper middle class Black woman or man during that particular time period. So whatever is going to help us understand that, those are the details that are going to matter. So
Yeah.
always coming back to story and character.
Yeah. And a question came in specifically for Des. Assuming, so, I mean, you wrote your book while here in the US, right? I mean,
Yeah.
yeah. Do you think it would have been very different if you had written it while living in Jamaica?
Yeah. Would it have been different? I'll say this, the really interesting part of that question for me is the level of patois, right? Because when I first wrote it, I wrote it in pretty thick patois, kind of sometimes like where my family mostly is, the patois is so heavy, I don't understand it all the time. And it's, very fast, very thick, and, sometimes filled with, new phrases. And I think if I were in Jamaica, I would have that tendency, like, so if I were going to market Your Corner Dark only in Jamaica, I would amp up the level of patois by being, in the environment more. But I found, with my non-Jamaican readers or readers that aren't, as familiar with patois, I had to pull it back a little bit because there's a great opportunity there because almost all Jamaicans, and a lot of people don't know this, can speak the Queen's English as well as patois, and a lot of times, when a lot of tourists aren't around, Jamaicans will joke about speaking the Queen's English, and will speak properly, and like, because, you just don't speak that way when you speak with family. And in fact, I noticed something in Nancy's book that had an equivalent where, the family when together speaks a bit different using vernacular of the culture. And so I think in that way, being in Jamaica or marketing the book to Jamaica specifically and only would have been different than, trying to make it a more universal story and one where, everyone can understand the dialogue.
Cool. Okay. So we will wrap up, but thank you guys all so much. Reminder, the author's books are all for sale via Belmont Books, and the link is in the chat. And also, please donate to the Novel Incubator Scholarship Fund if you can. And the next Craft on Draft will be in the fall, and hopefully in person. So check the Craft on Draft website for details. Thank you so much, Belmont Books. And Rob, thank you for managing the chat. And to all the incubators who keep Craft on Draft running, thank you everybody. And thanks everybody for attending. Just thank yous all around. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
I have some too. Thank you all for coming. Julie, Nancy, and Des, thank you so much. It was a great event. Leslie, thank you for moderating. And Rob, thank you for your help with the chat. Really appreciate it. And I hope everyone stays well and has a great night. Thanks again.
Good night.
Right.